Welcome to lecture for research methods. Just a quick little lecture with a couple of tips about writing the method section of your proposal. Okay. The basic components of a method section, the design, participants, materials, sometimes called the measures section, and the procedure. Now each of these is a subsection of the methods section, and then each of these may also potentially have further subsections of their own. Although typically design and participants don't, materials and procedure are the sections that sometimes you need to break down further if there's a lot of information there and it may help the reader to subdivide further. Okay, the design section, information you want in there, the type of design, so at least the macro level, if it's experimental, quasi-experimental, correlational, non-equivalent control group, whatever. And then as best you can get more specific. So if you're doing an experimental design or a quasi-experimental design, you should be able to go a step further and say if it's between subjects experimental design, within subjects experimental design, repeated measures, mixed subjects, which one of those applies depending on your design choices in terms of the factors you're looking at. So pretty much one sentence saying what design you're using, and typically you can do that by saying, a blah 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 design will be used to look at whatever. Then you've got your research question, right? And the other thing you want to do is identify your variables that you're going to study, the ones you're going to manipulate and the ones you're going to measure. So you want to identify them and give them operational definitions. So between subjects experimental design will be used to determine if varying the brightness in a classroom has an effect on student performance. Brightness in the classroom will be manipulated using lamps, and student performance will be measured using the SAT. Whatever. That's all you got to say. It's a couple of sentences, and that's all you need in the design section. So start off your method section with that subsection. An example here. A between subjects experimental design will be used to examine the effects of caffeine on students' ability to concentrate. So I've told you the type of design. It's experimental, and moreover it's between subjects, and I've identified the variables. I'm looking at caffeine and I'm looking at concentration, and you know which one's the independent variable, right, already, because it's the effects of caffeine. So caffeine's the independent variable and the ability to concentrate is the dependent variable. You don't have to say the independent variable will be, the dependent variable will be. Don't say that. Just say the effects of blank on blank, and people will know which one's the IV, which one's the DV. Okay. Goes on further to give operational definitions. Half of the participants will be given a capsule with 10 milligrams of caffeine, and the other half of the participants will be given visually identical capsules that contain no caffeine. Right? So I showed you how I'd operationally define the independent variable. And I didn't say the operational definition is, I just said it. Right? And then for concentration will be measured using the Fiala concentration test, and I cite a test that I made up just now. Okay? So that's all you need for your design section. Participant section, you need to include major demographics, and even if you're not going to be making any predictions about differences based on biological sex, ethnicity, or age, you still, when you've conducted a study, you still talk about who is in your sample, and when you're proposing a study, you talk about who's likely to be in your sample too, just because it gives people a frame of reference for, okay, when we get this information, we'll be able to compare it to these other people. Like if these are all children, these are all adults, is this only white males between the ages of 18 and 25? Okay, it's a fairly narrow band. People want to know that both when evaluating completed research and then also when evaluating a proposal in terms of deciding if it's going to be, if it merits funding or approval, what have you. So obviously it's something that's easier to write about for completed research. And in your proposal, you don't want to say, I had 50 men and 50 women, because you didn't have anybody. It's a proposal. So if you intend to recruit equal amounts of men and women, if that's something that you think is important for your study, then you say that equal numbers of men and women will be recruited for participation. Okay. If ethnicity, if you want to make sure that your sample is representative of the population, then say that efforts will make to recruit a sample that's representative of the ethnic distribution in this area, which is, and then you cite some data from the census data or whatever about the different ethnic groups. If not, you say you can describe the area potentially that the study will occur in, or you can say ethnicity is not a significant variable in the study, and therefore it will not be used when considering recruitment or selection of participants. The same thing for any other major variable. So you hit those major ones at least at minimum, and then you may also have to talk about some uniquely relevant demographics and uniquely relevant to your study. All right, so if you say you're doing a study on soldiers, then you probably need to be clear about what soldiers you're talking about. Participants will be recruited who are members of the United States Army stationed at Fort Hood or stationed at a large military base in the South, if you want to give an appropriate level of description. And if you want to say that they'll be infantry or cavalry or whatever, right? Depends on if it's important for your study, if it's important for a reader to know that thing about them. Okay. If you're doing kids, you're probably going to say kids aged 9 to 10 in grades, whatever, right? So if you're talking about adults, you don't know what grade they're in, so it's only relevant if you're doing a kid study. If you're looking at some sort of clinical population, you'll probably want to talk about diagnosis and whether or not people that have comorbid diagnoses will be included or not. Okay, so those relevant demographics, recruitment plan. So you have a proposal. Participants will be recruited via whatever, flyers and brochures, the internet, posting ads in the newspaper and local media. Whatever your plan is to recruit participants, you say that. You want to make sure you mention what participants' motivation for participation would be, and that's either participation in the study will be voluntary, or participants who agree to participate in the study will be compensated with whatever, and you make up something. And the last thing, any inclusion and exclusion criteria. So participants will only be included if they're above the age of 18, only if they have are positive for a history of sexual abuse. They'll be excluded if they have if their depression is comorbid with a substance use disorder, whatever. So how are you going to decide what rules you're going to have for who can be in your study and who can't be? Okay. And it's up to you to decide what you want those to be. You just need to be clear about what they are. Okay. The materials section, which sometimes you'll see it, and I'm okay with you, if you want to call it your measures section, that's fine, as long as the only thing in it are measures. And materials is often a better heading, I think, because it's more inclusive, because materials includes both measures and other things that aren't measures. Okay. But you want to talk about all your measured variables. So your dependent variable, if you're doing a correlation study, your criterion, predictor variables, all those things include the name of the measure you would use to measure the variable and a brief description of it. So the Beck Depression Inventory is a 20-item, blah, 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 multiple choice questionnaire. So you give a little sentence about what it is. I think it's a good idea often to give at least one example question from a measure. Right? Participants respond to items such as I feel very depressed, using a rating scale that ranges from 1, not at all true of me, to 5, very true of me. Okay, so something like that for each measure. And also, for each measure, make sure you have something in there, a sentence or two about the measure's psychometric properties. Right? And you're going to have to cite where this information came from, often from the manual of that instrument. And you may, gee, where do I find that? Well, first, the laziest way to do it would be find another article that used that tool, and they'll have cited psychometric properties, and then you can look up who they cited, and then go back and read that, and then cite them. So, some sentence like, this measure has previously been demonstrated to have good reliability, alpha equals 0.98, and correlate with other relevant constructs, and then parentheses some citation. Right. So talk about the psychometric properties, reliability and validity for each measure. Provide a citation for any published measures. Right. So the first time you talk about the Beck Depression Inventory, there should be parentheses and Beck, comma, whatever the year was that he first published that measure. And again, if you're not sure how to do that, find somebody else that wrote an article using that tool, and they'll probably show you. So for all your measures, you'll have that all that information, and then if you have any special materials or equipment to be used, and things like, you're going to be people are going to be filling out a survey, and they're going to do it on a computer. You don't really need to describe the computer. Or paper and pencil, you have to describe the pencil, not that level of specificity. If you're going to be using a tachistoscope, you need to describe what that is. Right? If you're going to be using something to measure heart rate, you need to tell the name of the tool so people can look it up, make sure, and see if it's been used in other studies, and they can also try to use it themselves if they want to replicate your study. So special materials, not all materials. Hopefully that's clear. The procedure section. Okay, this is you start off designs, big picture, participants, who's going to be in it, materials, what am I going to use, and procedure, what am I going to do. This is the meat of your method section. Pieces of information that should be in there. Group assignment. So if you have any kind of experimental design, say if you're using random assignment. If you're not using random assignment, say what else is you're using to create your groups. Or if you have existing groups, be clear about that here as well. Talk about where and when the study will take place. Right? And again, at an appropriate level of specificity. Don't need the exact time and address. So don't need to saying the study will be conducted at 8 a.m. on Thursday of North Campus of Texas A&M University, Central Texas. You don't need to do that. And in fact, you need to be mindful to protect the confidentiality and perhaps anonymity of your participants by using an appropriate level of specificity. So if you were going to gather participants from A&M Central Texas, you wouldn't say that. You would say from a regionally accredited university in the South or Southwest, depending on where you think Texas is. And you do that so that if somebody else is reading the study, and especially if you have a unique population, they don't go, oh, geez, I know everybody in that area who has a child with autism. I bet I know who was in that study. Right? They're losing some of their privacy potentially if you do that. So we're a little bit vague when describing where things will happen, but not too vague. Right? An appropriate level of specificity is important. Beyond that, what's given or done to participants. So participants will be asked to complete a survey that will take approximately 10 to 15 minutes, or participants will be exposed to the fearful stimuli for 30 seconds, and then have 2 minutes to respond. Whatever you're doing to them, describe it. Right? And especially if you're going to give them measures, you name those measures, but you don't describe them again. So you already described the Beck depression inventory up in your measures section, material section. So in this section, you'd say participants will be asked to complete or directed to complete the BDI-2, and you don't have to say the BDI is a blah 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 because you already said it. That's why you have that material section. So most people will skip to the procedure first, see what you did, and if there's a measure they're not familiar with, they'll jump back to that material section and say, okay, geez, what was that thing? I never heard of that. Okay. Um, Describe interventions you're going to use. So if you say, I'm going to look at this type of therapy versus this type of therapy, well, what's this type of therapy going to look like? Are you using some manual to guide this intervention? Are you doing anything to make sure that the therapists in the study would do it the same way across participants in terms of standardization? What's going to happen? You can't just say, participants will be given cognitive behavioral therapy. Well, cognitive behavioral therapy looks very different depending on who's doing it. So you need to describe with as much detail as is appropriate what you're going to do. It doesn't need to be word for word what the therapists are going to say, but it needs to be much better than we'll do CBT, right? So we'll do 6 sessions of CBT, and if it's going to be following the model prescribed by so-and-so, and then you can cite them, people can go look it up. If you're making up a therapy regime, well, you've got to describe that in quite a bit of detail. So I recommend not making something up. And if you're going to just be real vague about it and say, well, it's just CBT as the therapists define it, then say that. The therapist will be given no direction when interacting with participants other than to offer cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay, well, that's kind of a crappy study, but at least you're describing what you did appropriately. Okay, and again, be sure to cite appropriately if borrowing or replicating. So if you found some article, the way somebody did something, and you really like their method, give them a little shout out, give them some props. Participants, the design used will be similar to that employed by Michelitzer and Petty, 2004. So you're saying, okay, yeah, we got the idea of how to do this study, or maybe just this part of the study from these folks over here, and you give them credit for that. And then also make sure you touch on timing and sequence of events. So this is going to happen, then this, then this, then this, and how long things are generally going to take. Okay, wrapping up. The keys to a good method section. Again, an appropriate level of detail. So what you're doing should be clear to the reader. There should be clarity. And there should be potential for replication, where somebody could look at what, again, if you had a completed study, somebody could look at what you did and say, oh yeah, okay, I see what they did here. I wonder if I could find it with this other group, and they can take your method section as a recipe book and go recreate it. Right? They don't have to go, I wonder how they expose people to a feared stimulus. They didn't say what the stimulus was. You say what it is, right? An appropriate level of specificity. Ending with proposal, appropriate enough that people can decide if this is a good idea or not to do this study. Okay. A good method section doesn't have kind of these glaring holes, doesn't have these big confounds. Well, geez, this study, if you ultimately followed what they're saying they would do, there's no internal validity here because there's this huge confound. It's a big design flaw. That could be a problem for a method section. Don't see that too often. Usually I catch those and help you with them beforehand, but keep an eye out for it. The other thing to do to be successful is explicitly address validity. Right? And you get points for this in your on the rubric. Make sure you explain your choices in terms of promoting a particular aspect of validity. So if you're going to say random assignment will be used, perfect opportunity. Random assignment will be used to promote internal validity. Excellent. Right? The blah 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 measure will be used, which is shown to have strong psychometric properties, and you cite somebody. Using this measure will promote the construct validity. Great. So talk about your choices, why you're doing them, and how they have an impact on internal validity, external validity, constant validity, and potentially even power. Especially when you're talking about the participant section, you're going to be talking about power. Okay, that's all for now. Good luck.